As humans, we've always been aware of our natural environment. We depend on it for our survival, and we enjoy its beauty. But in the last few decades, there's been a growing concern about the state of our planet. With the onset of climate change, there's a real danger that our planet will become less suitable for human habitation. Now, we might think that nature is valuable purely because of the benefits it gives us. It keeps us warm, feeds us, and it gives us enjoyment. But it might be the case that nature is intrinsically valuable in its own right, apart from the effects that it has on us. If that's true, what kind of actions do we need to take towards nature to go about properly respecting that value? The view that nature has intrinsic value is a key element in an outlook called deep ecology. Peter Singer told me more about this.
They thought that it wasn't enough to justify protecting the environment in terms of the interests of humans or non-human animals. They wanted to say that there is intrinsic value in plants and forests and mountains and rivers, even things that were not living had intrinsic value.
Treating nature with respect doesn't require a deep ecology outlook. A more human-centric perspective is still enough to generate a requirement that we don't cut down these trees. They help keep us alive, and they look good. In the modern world, we aren't just concerned about the ethics of cutting down this bunch of trees here. We're more concerned now about the effects of cutting down and processing trees en masse when it comes to the whole planet. That's because we better understand nowadays the way in which the global ecosystem is interconnected.
Climate change, I think, is one of the huge moral challenges that we face in the beginning of the 21st century. Given that the effects of climate change are going to be most severely felt on some of the poorest people in the world who have very low greenhouse gas emissions, it's obviously a moral problem because here are these wealthy people doing things that are going to be devastating for much poorer people, and they really don't need to do it. So there's something wrong going on here.
This raises an important question about justice. If an oil tanker spills its load into the ocean, then we expect the company that owns the tanker to pay for the cleanup. But what about, for example, islands in the South Pacific that are getting flooded by gradually rising sea levels? Who exactly caused that? And who should fix it? If rich countries benefit from emitting greenhouse gases, but the poorer countries are the ones that get most hurt by the effects, then surely the onus is on wealthier countries to change their behaviour. Katie, hi. Watch out for the brown snakes. I asked Katie Steele whether richer countries have a particularly great obligation to help the poor ones.
There's a principle, the polluter pays principle, which supports this idea. And it's a very compelling principle, and it's the sort of principle that tends to find agreement amongst people of different moral persuasion. I mean, if you caused a mess, you should clean it up, basically. Now, there's been a fair amount of criticism about this principle or how exactly it would operate in the context of climate change. And people have worried about the finer details. I mean, who are we talking about? Nations, not individuals. How do we sort of work out exactly what the baseline should be against which we measure the harm? I mean, what should be regarded as normal? But in general, I think we shouldn't sort of lose sight of this principle. We could just say rich countries should pay more, you know, and personally, I'm sort of fairly sympathetic to that idea. It's just, if you've got the resources, clearly this is a big, important global issue. Rich countries should pay more. But if we can sort of couple that, and in many cases the two coincide, almost every case, rich countries also polluted a lot. If you can couple that with the idea of polluter pays, sort of all the more power.
Clearly, we all have a shared stake in keeping our environment relatively stable and minimising damage. But if I switch to green power, it's going to be my electricity bill that starts going up. This is just one way in which the needs of individuals have to compete with this more collective need to save the planet. The problem isn't going to be solved unless we find a way for individuals to cooperate more easily. Trouble is, This cooperation has to be both immediate and on a global scale. That's what makes the problem so hard. Peter Singer explains.
Climate change is an unusual problem because it's essentially what's sometimes called the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons is if you have common land and all of the villages around the commons have the right to graze their cattle on it, then each villager individually has an interest in putting more cattle on the commons because they will get a better return for themselves. But if they all do that, then the commons will be overgrazed, the grass won't grow, all of the cattle will die, everybody will be worse off. Climate change is like that. Each nation has their own interest in generating energy as cheaply as possible, but that will emit more greenhouse gases. So you need to get cooperative action from all the major nations of the world. And that's always been a problem because there is no world government, there's no real institutions that can enforce that and bring it about. So you need to rely on the voluntary cooperation. The Paris Agreement, for example, that was reached at the end of 2015, really is based on what is referred to as naming and shaming those who don't meet their commitments.
And I urge Africa to join us in rejecting old divides between North and South so we can forge a strong global climate agreement this year in Paris. Because sparing some of the world's poorest people from rising seas, more intense droughts, shortages of water and food is a matter of survival and a matter of human dignity.
So if countries don't meet their commitments, then everybody will know about it. Hopefully they will criticize them for it. They'll feel ashamed. But if they just say, well, to hell with it, there's not going to be any way of enforcement.
But here's a completely different question. What about biodiversity? Climate change is progressing, and for some species, time is running out. If we're passionate about the environment, should we be putting more resources into saving these species? Or have we got our priorities wrong? I asked Peter Singer about this.
Take an endangered species like the whooping crane in the United States, very similar to a lot of other cranes that are not endangered. Right? So if the whooping cranes die out, it'll be sad for the small number, hundreds of cranes still in existence, but no worse than if hundreds of other cranes of a more common species were to die. They may be playing a role in ecosystems, that there'll be further consequences if they're removed. Although, of course, once a species gets down to really small numbers, that's pretty unlikely that it's going to make that much difference. So you have to say, well, is it a bad thing? You might say, oh, yes, well, it's a bad thing for future generations of humans because they will like to see diversity. That's reasonable. I regret that I can no longer see amazing animals like Stella's sea cow, which was wiped out in the 18th century just for hunting, so on. I regret that. So it's a factor. It's not something to be completely ignored. We may enjoy learning things about other species that we're wiping out, but for the sake of the species themselves, I don't think species are conscious entities. I don't think they have a stake in that way. They don't have interests. So, and if the interests of individuals of endangered species are no greater than those of individuals of non-endangered species, then it's hard to see an intrinsic value in loss of biodiversity apart from those consequences. If somehow I could snap my fingers and solve one moral problem, and I could choose between saving the polar bears and, let's say, preventing all of the factory farming that causes suffering to tens of billions of animals each year, yeah, I would go for the factory farmed animals.
Here's another angle on this topic. Would it really be so bad if we did wreck the planet and we all died out at some time in the future? Why should I care if any human beings are around thousands of years from now? Might it be better to just invest our resources on benefiting the current generation of actual people and not worry so much about the distant future?
Some people are very moved by human extinction. I'm not personally moved by that. But I think it's a mistake to take this sort of very long-term universe view. You know, we're getting closer to the sun, are we? I don't know. So eventually we're going to die out anyway. It's just a matter of timing, climate change, human extinction. It's going to happen. why not a bit earlier than we thought? I think that's a mistake. We sort of should think as far as what we think we're capable of making a difference towards. It's happening rapidly. We're not prepared for it, so that is just going to lead to a lot of suffering of individuals, basically. So we shouldn't be tempted by this sort of long-term picture. Of course, the Earth doesn't care. It's been through various ice ages. You know, it'll survive. But these are individuals that we're talking about who are going to be in a much worse predicament. That's the worry, yeah.
We are one of the species in an ecosystem. And when we change our environment, that ecosystem is going to get disrupted. That's going to impact most on humans and animals that are least able to adapt to rapid change, whether it be loss of habitat or sheer lack of financial resources. There are real ethical concerns about how we treat nature. At the moment, governments are not doing enough to address climate change. We all owe it to each other to find a way past this. Climate change might be the biggest ethical challenge currently facing the human race. Philosophy can seem like a kind of rarefied or ivory tower project, but it's really vital if we're going to learn how to make the world better and fairer. Philosophy might even help save the world. What do you think?